the wisdom of entheogenic plants and fungi, the beauty of natural healing, and the importance of reconnecting with sacred earth. Twice a month, we'll hear from visionaries, healers, and advocates who are working with entheogenic plants and fungi, exploring realms of consciousness, and returning us to a balanced relationship with nature. We're excited to have Sebastian here. This is getting close to season 3 being over. We're going to do a couple more shows before the summer, take a little break in the summertime, and come back again in the fall for season 4. It's been quite a little journey, and excited to be here with you all. My name is Larry Norris. I'm the co-founder of Decriminalize Nature and the National Organizing Director. In this role, I've been able to help teams all across the U.S. Adopt policy and pass policy in their local jurisdiction to effectively decriminalize or deprioritize and defund entheogens such as mushrooms with psilocybin and psilocin, cacti with mescaline, plants that have ibogaine, and plant combinations similar to ayahuasca that have DMT. If you'd like to pass policy in your local area or anywhere in the world and connect with the movement, please go to decriminalizenature.org, reach out to us, and we'll be happy to invite you to our monthly orientation, teach you up on how to pass in your local jurisdiction and how to pitch this to your city council members. I'd also like to introduce our behind-the-scenes producer, Rachel. Thank you so much for being here, as always. The anchor that keeps us around and keeps it going here behind the scenes. So really appreciating it. Thank you, Rachel, for all your support. Rachel will be moderating the chat as well. So if you have any questions or comments you want to put in there, please go ahead and put that in there, and we'll be answering those in the last 10 minutes. This today will be going on platforms like YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, etc. But we'll be putting these on Spotify and other podcast platforms in the next couple of weeks, so you can check them out there as well. If you'd like to make a donation to help support this amazing movement and show, you can do that in the podcast platform as well by clicking the button below. So please go ahead and do that and help us out. And if you have any questions, like I said, please go ahead and add those in the chat box, and we'll be addressing those about the last 10 minutes. Our guest today, really excited to have someone here to talk about the topic we're talking about today. It's something that I've always been curious about, but it's so seldom you find people that are specialists in this area. So really excited to have Sebastian William Foster here today. He's an attorney in South Africa and a legal academic presenting at conferences and events across the world. I believe the next one you will be at is here in San Francisco at the Chacruna Psychedelic and Culture Conference, which I believe is happening next weekend, the 14th, 15th, 16th, or Bicycle Day weekend, basically. So if you're in San Francisco, come check it out. I believe Sebastian will be speaking at 10 a.m. on Friday, the 15th, if that's correct. And then also, if you have any thoughts and you're in South Africa or anywhere else in the world, I'm sure that Sebastian will be happy to talk to you about cognitive liberty, freedom of thought, and how this is a fundamental right. I've had some great conversations with Sebastian in the past. We spoke together at the Global Psychedelic Week conference last year, about 6 months ago or whatever, and had an incredible conversation. I was like, hey, we should talk a little bit more on the podcast. So really happy to have you here and really excited to learn from you as well. So how are you doing today, Sebastian?
Oh, Larry, that was quite a welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this podcast. This is my first podcast, so I'm very excited to be a part of it. And doing very well. Yeah, happy Easter to everybody around the world. Very excited to share whatever knowledge I have, and this is going to be a good one. Let's hope for the best.
Great, awesome. Well, we're happy to be the first podcast as well. It's a fun little place to be, that's for sure. We had some good conversations. Maybe before we start off, you could maybe share a little bit of your background, your bio, kind of how you got interested in this area, and kind of where you're going from here.
Yeah, sure. So let's start this off. Obviously, my name is Sebastian William Foster. I'm from South Africa. My journey with psychedelics and the law started when I was doing my law degree at Stellenbosch University. It was never something I intended to fall into, but fell into it, and I'm happy to have be part of this journey so far. So effectively, as I said, growing up, psychedelics were not on my radar whatsoever, or drugs, actually, not at all, or substances. And then when I was doing my LLB, my law degree at Stellenbosch, in my penultimate year, I wanted to write a dissertation, so a 10,000 word paper on something that was a little bit more controversial. I think the law can sometimes feel quite stagnant, depending on what area you're in. And basically, we had just come off South Africa's first decriminalization case. This was in the case of cannabis. And I had a number of topics, and I spoke to my supervisor about all these topics, and she kept kind of saying, tone down, like, you only got 10,000 words, these are all PhD-ish topics. Again, I think I was just trying to change the world at a young age. And so I kind of sat down and thought, well, maybe the next sexy topic would be to apply the logic in the case that partially decriminalized cannabis and applied to the next, in my head, I said the next drug. The next drug for me ended up being psilocybin mushrooms. And then I started doing research into this. Again, I fell into this completely novel. Of course, I knew what these substances were, and I think that obviously played into me wanting to do this topic. I found it attractive. I found it new. Did a lot of research into psilocybin. Through that process, actually got in contact with a lawyer who worked on the cases to partially decriminalize cannabis. He put me on to cognitive liberty, which before I'd never heard of. And effectively, through the research, through this dissertation, I ended up writing one of the articles that later got published, an article on cognitive liberty, which was the first in South Africa to kind of argue that the right to cognitive liberty does exist in the South African Constitution. But not just that, but also argue that it should be a right through which we should decriminalize psilocybin. We're obviously going to get into that conversation in this podcast. But yeah, from there, I finished my law degree. I went into practice. The same lawyer and his team reached out to me and mentioned that there was a case that they were trying to decriminalize psilocybin in South Africa. So as a trainee lawyer, I was invited to be a part of that team, which was incredible. Very few young lawyers, I think, get the opportunity to be so ingrained in such an important case. And they really supported me on that one. And then I left practice to go back into academia. Did a year at UCT doing a master's. Ended up meeting a professor from Switzerland who offered to supervise a PhD. Ended up leaving UCT and now doing a master's at the University of Göttingen in international law, as well as a PhD at the University of Zürich, where my focus is primarily on psychedelic substances. But now I've shifted my focus away from South Africa's jurisdiction and more onto the international sphere, where obviously, as you may know, all of our psychedelic drugs, the criminalization started internationally. So yeah, that's a little bit of my story now. I'm still obviously very young, getting into it. Trying to play my part. I certainly love the challenge of, the way I see it is seeing an issue with the way in which our laws are at the moment, finding the kind of chinks, and then looking into it with great detail. And obviously this is an exciting new, well, I say new, it's a field that's experiencing a renaissance. And with all that new information comes new possibilities. And I certainly think, playing the part in it from a legal perspective is very exciting. I'm happy to hear to share it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sebastian. Yeah, and you've actually picked two topics that are kind of new because while new old, right? Psychedelics is something that we've
Yeah.
been talking about forever, but now because of this legal issue over the last 50 years, we got to sort of undo that. And secondly, this idea of cognitive liberty, really didn't exist in terms of a term before the 90s. And before that, it was sort of implied or, these other kind of ideas. And even cognitive liberty, which we're talking on a little bit, where it's both protection from and protection from infringement as well as protection to be able to have. So maybe we can talk about that in a second as well. But before we jump into that, like what in general in South Africa, and now you're in Switzerland, I imagine those are two different culturally, different places in terms of acceptance of these different substances. Actually, Switzerland, where LSD was discovered at once upon a time, and coming up with Bicycle Day weekend, that's happened right there in Basel, and then South Africa. What is kind of the history of the sort of psychedelic movement? What is the kind of the feel, the vibe in South Africa right now? Is there a pushback around this issue? Is it sort of accepted? Is there an underground culture there? What's that look like in South Africa?
Yeah, good question. I think comparatively to America, or even areas in Europe, I don't think it's as big of a culture. Certainly underground. I imagine as it is in most places of the world, there's certainly a huge underground culture. But in terms of above ground, there isn't as much of, I'd say, a movement just yet. I still think we're finding our feet. I think historically, it's fair to say South Africa's been quite slow moving on these sort of topics. I mean, just taking, I can share my own experience when it came to the cannabis decriminalization. That was a long, slow process that went through through the courts, as opposed to being, a political drive from the populace. Comparing it to the rest of the world, it's a difficult one for me at the moment because, again, I'm based in Germany and I have obviously a leg in Switzerland, but so much of my work in Europe at the moment is is based on international law. So I'm trying to focus on that, less so, I guess throwing myself into the culture of the people there. And so I can only speak anecdotally on like my experiences with people and, having conversations with people about psychedelics. Certainly back home here in South Africa, it's been a very interesting conversation in the sense that there's so much still to be learned. I think, South Africa, there hasn't been a huge, I'd say, movement that has, really kind of grasped everybody's attention. So this isn't an everyday conversation. I often find myself, when people do ask about my work, because it is kind of, it's interesting, it's new, it's novel. There's a lot of stigma that I kind of have to roll back a little bit, which I'm sure you can relate to. I'm sure many of your audience can relate to. Most of I'd say the biggest issue that we've dealt with in this topic is rolling back the stigma that has been caused over the past 60, 70, 80 years. Sharing with people that, actually these substances do not carry the harm that we once thought they did, or we were told they did. Finding out that they could be, very beneficial, medically beneficial. That's also something that is quite novel and new. And I mean, I don't know if you experience this, but I often get people sharing things with me about, how psychedelics of all different types are being used medically, which is, I always find it lovely when people share that with me, and it's almost like this massive surprise. So I still think that, there's a lot of learning still to be done. We don't necessarily have massive organizations that are, in parliament advocating every single day. Hopefully, over the next 10 years, that ball speeds up a little bit, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I like how you also you'll probably see this as you're moving forward, is how even within our bubble of policy, right, you have sort of the medicalization, and I really almost see cognitive liberty as almost the extreme opposite of medicalization, because it's basically saying, hey, you should have the right to be able to explore your mind, your consciousness. You shouldn't be arrested for this. And medicalization is like, if you have a particular pathology or problem or issue or challenge you're working with, and you need to speak with a medical practitioner, you can pay this amount and go into this place, and it's going to be sanitized and watered down and da da da. And so, what happens, what shifts in terms of the experience itself, or the healing properties of the experience, and this would be, a really interesting study to do someday in the future, is like, through a cognitive liberty model, would there be more potential for healing, even because it's more broad range? It maybe gets to like the core issues, whereas maybe treatment of depression, you're just dealing with depression and not dealing with the personal and spiritual growth that might be the catalyst for getting less depressed. So I think there's an interesting conversation in terms of that, how the medical, and we have the medical, the cognitive liberty, we have the sacramental, which is kind of the religious approach, right? And then we have sort of the legalization framework, which is also kind of happening a little bit here and there, but that maybe falls more under more of a regulated model, if you will. What are your thoughts in terms of the different approaches that people are working with right now?
So yeah, good question. I actually recently kind of, I'd say, down the rabbit hole of my research for my current thesis, I found it I had to kind of step back, and I found it quite difficult to note all the different angles that one could take going forward with decriminalization or regulation. In doing so, again, I kind of had to step back and wash away some of the confusion, because there are so many avenues. And I think the avenue that's getting obviously the most attention at the moment, certainly, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the States, is this medical avenue, where it seems to be getting all the noise, and it seems to be winning, because there seems to be the most major breakthroughs, not just in the States, but I'd say globally. That's where, psychedelics are kind of breaking through a little bit. I don't know if that particularly is the best route forward. I mean, as you mentioned, for me, I find the risk of that is that you are now categorizing these substances as only a medicine. Mm-hmm. One of the things that my research has enlightened me to, and I'm very fortunate for this, is that I've gone into a lot of historical data about psychedelics. And when you do that, you start to realize that, well, first and foremost, these substances have been used throughout all of humanity. Mm-hmm. All cultures have engaged with psychedelics. And they've engaged with it in a number of different facets. So it's not just medical. And my fear, and I think many people may share this, is that if you try and place these substances into the medical box, you're going to limit its true potential. Mm-hmm. Now, the next question is, what is the right way? And that is going to be a very interesting conversation I hope to get to and be a part of one day. I've tried to kind of temper myself a little bit by not, putting the cart ahead of the horse and for my own research, and kind of stay focused on what I guess my goal is here, is showing that the laws do not adequately, they don't meet up properly. There's issues with the law. And if we can say, okay, yes, there is an issue with the law, whether it be in South Africa, it's not constitutional, it doesn't meet the requirements the Constitution places on us, or whatever other avenues that I'm potentially going to argue my master's and my PhD thesis. If we get to that conversation and we go, okay, cool, then what do we do now? And then comes the conversation on the best avenue. If I could speak to it, I would say that cognitive liberty for me, from what I understand from all the different avenues I've looked at, when I say avenues, I mean medicalization, there's the recreational only, there's, looking at a commercial substance, all these different avenues. The way I kind of see this, instead of fighting at each other for, who wins, I do see cognitive liberty as like the ideal umbrella. And we can get it. Well, obviously, we will get into this further in the podcast. But because of how it is a protection of not just your psychological integrity, but it allows you to actively engage with your conscious. I do think that provides the highest degree of protection, and probably, I believe, is the best route when we're focusing our decolonization avenue. What is the best avenue? I do think when you keep that as the core we have to achieve, that the highest aim we have to achieve, I think that will probably lead to the best route forward.
Yeah, no, I think we as an organization pretty much agree with that as well, as we're talking about, how do you help people, like you say, get the most protections, allow for them to explore in the ways that feel comfortable for them, to be in community relevant settings, culturally relevant settings that work for them, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like cognitive liberty at least allows the bigger blanket for that. And you said earlier about how medical is getting a lot of attention here in the U.S. And while it has been, there's also been a lot of studies. The FDA trials didn't work for MAPS, a couple of, so they have this like behemoth gatekeeper in the way called the FDA and RCT
Hmm.
trials, and you have placebo issues and everything else. And so in a way, those haven't been as successful as we have been getting bombarded with. It's kind of like, the media almost kind of steps in and says, yes, this is the way to go. And, when you hear that, there's the mindset of like, okay, well, they're focusing just on this little bubble, even though we know that these materials can really help us understand a bigger concept of the systems that we're embedded in and how we can sort of unpack power dynamics and things like that. But all the news is really excited about this medicalization approach, and then you see the medicalization approach isn't really having that much success getting through the trials, despite the fact that we know thousands and thousands and thousands of anecdotal experiences, the N of one, the transformative experience where someone's like, wow, I don't do XYZ thing anymore, I don't have this condition anymore, or I feel better in my life every day, my health and wellness is better, all these types of things, benefit enhancement, which we can talk about with cognitive liberty as well, where you can't really talk about that with a pathology or a sickness. You're getting better, but what happens if you're okay already and you're sort of enhancing that benefit, which I think they looked at a little bit in the Johns Hopkins studies way back in the day for the healthy normal studies, which I think was really important. But yeah, for the most part, the medicalization is kind of dwindling a little bit right now because of some challenges, and then of course it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to go through the trials and everything else. So then where do people go? And I think that's again right where you kind of embed yourself, even in the resolutions we do while we talk about some of the science, talking about personal liberties, talking about human rights issues, talking about how people should be able to explore their own consciousness without getting too woo about it. I think people can get really behind that because they can see that as something like, okay, well, this is now for everybody instead of just being for people that can pay for it, the pay to play consciousness, so to speak. So I think that's something that's really important, and sort of you're probably seeing that as well. Just before we go too much further down that angle, I do want to just touch a little bit also on uh, in South Africa, if I remember correctly, just last year or the year before, they also discovered two new psilocybin species or psilocybe species down there. Did that have any sort of effect on the culture down there? Or did people already know about it and it just wasn't known sort of in the sort of general context? Did that like excite or motivate people to be more interested in this field?
Yeah, good question. One of my close friends and colleagues in this field was part of that Cullen Taylor Clark, like part of that discovery. Um, so I think actually, I mean, we go back further when you asked about, what's the relationship with psychedelics here in South Africa. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that, mainstream culture as I mentioned, there's an underground, a building overground. But then, we also forget that there's a huge traditional culture that is still, I'd say, very much largely under researched or under shared,
Mhm.
for lack of a better word. Which, I mean, Cullen and his colleagues are doing good work there, and hopefully uh, bringing a lot of that to light. Um, Sorry, just remind me of the question there. I've gone off topic.
Yeah, no, I was just if those two new mushroom species have catalyzed any sort of new conversations and getting people more excited about potentials of mushrooms because now they're locally, present as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. So, look, I mean, I can't particularly say that it's made being groundbreaking news in my own sphere. I'm sure in the mycology sphere it has been, but there's also an argument to say that we in South Africa are very aware that these substances are all over the show. I mean, South Africa has this unique ability to grow very um, good quality, psychoactive substances, be it cannabis or psilocybin. Um, and it's I mean, personally for me, when I heard that, it's great to know that it's being rediscovered. And my answer to it as well, I'm pretty sure there's thousands more out there. It's one of the problems, I guess, with Africa is that there just hasn't there isn't enough resources being thrown into conducting these discoveries. Again, I go into it, that we've got lots of traditional people who I'm sure have utilized these substances for hundreds of years, but that the knowledge isn't passed into the mainstream, media, mainstream science in the same way. So there's lots of work to be done. Uh, I hope we start getting in, the ball gets rolling. I'm very excited for that, and I'm sure it will happen sooner rather than later. And I'm looking forward to all the new discoveries that come out.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I think it was one of those things where you see like, hey, scientists newly discovers XYZ, psilocybe mushroom, and it's like, you think to yourself, how many people have known about that, for centuries or decades or whatever else, and but
Yeah,
now
exactly.
it's been sort of classified and people kind of know about it a little bit differently. So when you read that over here in the States, you're like, wow, okay, interesting. What else, like you're saying, what else is going on there? You have the 10,000-year-old or 10,000-year-old sort of cave paintings in Algeria, kind of much farther north and there in Africa. And so, there's been mushrooms that have been floating around and talked about and used for millennia out there. So it makes sense that there's, different ones that maybe we just didn't know about. There's a wonderful sort of speaker and practitioner and all around consciousness explorer named Kalindi Ii, comes out of Detroit. He passed away a few years ago, but he was talking about how few papers there were about psychedelics in Africa. But here we have so many different ecosystems and jungles and Sahara and all this kind of stuff. Like savanna plains, all these different places where these different substances can grow. We just don't know much about it. There's just not too much information out there. So I think there's a lot to be learned still in terms of the different plants out there. I mean, obviously you have, ibogaine as well, or iboga, and you have a couple other plants out there doing things. Even if I remember correctly, there's even some like sort of cannabis, or it's in the same kind of, I don't know, it's called something different. I forgot the name of it offhand, but in that same sort of category, maybe not criminalized in the same kind of way because people don't know about it. So maybe not knowing about it is a good thing because then you can't have a blanket, sort of penalty against anything that comes out. Is there any sort of like in South Africa, if a new thing comes out and new things discovered, were these automatically criminalized once they are found, or how does that work in terms of the law out there?
Yeah, good question. I mean, like, so psilocybin and psilocin are criminalized as like the
That's what.
chemical, right? So then the fruiting bodies, yeah, it's one of those situations here. Um, and I will add to that. I mean, you're right what you said. These mushrooms are newly discovered, but they're most likely have been here for millennia. And there's probably many, many more that need to be, arguably rediscovered or just brought into mainstream knowledge. Um, yeah, let me leave that there.
Sure, sure, yeah. So you said a little bit earlier also that there's different processes. So you have obviously we're working in the U.S. and you'd be happy if you have any questions around that. We can kind of go into that too. But obviously you're working, you started in South Africa. Now you're working kind of on the international stage. Is there one like? Because I'm always curious about this. Obviously on the local level here, it helps because we can build that local community. We can build a local sort of safety net. We can create support structures, all that kind of thing locally. So if anything challenging does happen, people are ready and prepared for it. But I'm always looking for that one leverage point. What's the one button we can push where what document is the one that if we do that one, and that sounds like what you're kind of looking for, everything else unravels? Is that the US policy? Is it the UN policy? What's the international stage that, we can maybe work on together globally to also do something as well as doing something on our local level?
Yeah, it's the 1971 Psychotropic Convention. That's kind of the original document, the original piece of law. Obviously, it's international, that brought about the prohibition of psychedelics and a number of other substances. And it's part of a treaty of international drug control conventions. That's, yes, 1971 one was the one that effectively lists or schedules psilocybin, LSD, DMT, um, mescaline, and that's what I refer to in my writing now as the psychedelic convention. That's the one that is really the start of it all. And what this convention does, like all other international laws, is effectively countries agree to it, and then they must now adopt, within, they say effectively adopt the same writing in the domestic laws, in the domestic jurisprudence.
It seems like I'm guessing that there's something slightly different that happened here because obviously our Controlled Substances Act was in 1970. So did the
Yeah.
1970 controlled substance, like how can we take apart this one and will that one fall apart or does that one have bigger standing? I know also in the 1971 document, if I remember correctly, either that one or a future one where it's amended that they make some sort of claim, and I think ICERS talks about this as well, where plants used for ritual purposes are not considered a Schedule One substance. So it kind of takes a slightly different tack than maybe sort of the Controlled Substances Act in the US. But did that one lead to the other? What was the power structure there that forced the UN convention to do this? Was it from the US or were they already kind of thinking about that ahead of time?
Yeah, so I mean, this is where the politics and the history, well, yeah, history and politics comes into play. So when we do look at the history, you're right. America came first with their act. What seems to be the case is when the U.S. government took quite a strong stance against the anti-war movement, it does seem to be that there's also a civil rights movement. There was a work against that. Um, certain substances were criminalized potentially politically as a means to, cause trouble within the communities of those who use them. I mean, again, this we kind of can look at this kind of black and white and go, well, it's interesting how alcohol and tobacco aren't criminalized, but then these other substances are. And if you look historically at who used what, there seems to be some correlations. Um, I mean, again, there's plenty of authors who have written on this. There's plenty. It's well documented as a from political angle and a sociology angle. So that's not really. I can't touch on that too much. I can only use it as informative. When looking at the law. When we moved to the United Nations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, obviously at the time we have to remember it's the Cold War. America is a very big player in the Cold War, bringing together, I guess, the West and arguably the world, the UN. And this was an important point for, I guess, the United States government was the control of substances, and then that became part of the Western, I guess, what's the best way to say this? Yeah, I guess part of the agenda for the West, and then that fell into the United Nations. Part of my research now for my master's is looking at those documents and looking at like, well, what was the conversation like when they were written, when they were built? What were the discussions between the UN nations? Thankfully for me, there's a paper that's just come out. I think it was in January this year, which did this. It took an archival look a deep look into the archives, looked at the documents, looked at the conversations that were had, and seems to show quite interestingly how these substances came to be scheduled. Again, I'm paraphrasing now from the authors of this paper, which I can obviously share with you later. And so if I make mistakes, hopefully I don't. But effectively, it seemed to be that there was a lot of fear over LSD. I mean, that seems to be the core issue. LSD was seen as this problem, this emerging problem in the 60s internationally. And then by the time we had the conversations for the 1971 convention, LSD was really viewed by the drafters and I guess all those at the convention as something that had the potential to be very dangerous for the world. Now, what's really interesting is the convention itself. It kind of explains what needs to be met to be a Schedule 1 substance. And one of the arguments I'm trying to make now is that those requirements were not even met back then in 1971 for all the psychedelics listed. What's really interesting is in the preparation documents and even to a degree in the commentary, is like the rest, it's only LSD that's really focused on. And what seems to have been the case is that LSD was seen as this potentially dangerous substance, this problem that can cause public health issues, and that anything that was similar to it was thrown out, as the baby with the bathwater. And so yeah, that's kind of what led to psychedelics kind of being placed into Schedule 1, because there isn't much evidence, if any, of like any medical or scientific data that says, this justifies our decision. This justifies the harshest regime of control globally for these substances. And effectively, to touch on what I'm trying to do now, and again, I haven't published anything yet, so nothing's concrete, and I could definitely be making mistakes. But what I'm trying to look into effectively is, if we have these thresholds, that these substances must, in other words, be dangerous, dependence producing, so addictive. They must have the potential to be a harm to public health, and they have limited to zero medical benefit. If we can now show that, well, psychedelics, and we can go through them individually, they don't seem to match this requirement to be under the most stringent control regime. Well, then there's an issue with the law, right? There's an issue with, you can't effectively call something what it isn't. And yeah, that's kind of, to touch on what I'm looking at now, is I'm looking at whether there's an arbitrary element in that.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. So if, as you're sort of looking over and trying to figure out where to best access this, would you say, in your opinion, that it would make more sense to, in this perfect world where we can do things like this, right? Would it make more sense globally to remove the Controlled Substances Act in the U.S. and have a bigger effect, or would it be to remove it in the UN? Does the UN have influence? Do you think if the UN was to stop that all the countries would abide by it, or would they still have their own individual laws? Like, how much of this is really being influenced by the US behind the scenes, and how much of this is kind of something that can change in terms of power dynamics?
Yeah, good question. I mean, look, I think so much of this has really kind of taught me as well, as like the interconnected relationship between law and politics. I mean, as a lawyer, I kind of want to see the law as the law must match up to what we say, it must be there. But then politics plays a huge influence in the game. So to answer your question, I mean, the reason I'm looking personally at the international law is, my viewpoint is that, well, if I can find an issue in like a clink in the armor of the international law, that then brings into question arguably all domestic laws that have agreed to this international law on the premises that that they thought to be true. And especially, for example, in South Africa, my logic flows that if I find an issue with how the law was made internationally, that argument should be bridged into South African law, so therefore can be made here in our courts. I imagine the same arguments could be made then in other jurisdictions' courts. Because at the end of the day, as in South Africa and in most jurisdictions, the state bears the burden of proving that these substances are what they say it is.
Mhm.
And this has certainly been one of the issues that I've had to deal with so far in my career. Is people often go, well, these substances are clearly dangerous. They clearly have dependence producing effects. Uh, and then I kind of have to turn back and go, okay, but then show me.
Mhm.
Let me. Do you have evidence of this? I mean, just sharing something briefly. When I first started writing this, on my very first for the dissertation, I got into it and I started writing, and I came in with a clear mind. I didn't come in with I like to believe I didn't come in with a bias. I didn't have a reason to have this bias. And I was doing this research and finding a lot of medical journals that were dealing with they're studying psychedelics, and in this case it was psilocybin. And they were concluding in these studies that actually the harm isn't as big as we initially thought it was. If at all. And I had a conversation with my supervisor at the time, who I mean, I see where she was coming from, and I respect her, but she was cautious, and she was like, this looks a little bit biased. It's like you're effectively saying that substance that's been criminalized for 60, 70 years internationally, and a little bit less than that domestically, has no danger. Um, and I was like, well, this is just these are the articles. I've cited them. I mean, I think my original papers have almost 50% are medical journals, so the referencing is there. It was thorough work. And she was like, this appears biased. You need to go and find harm. Um, effectively kind of there was a bit of a moment of irony there, where I was like, okay, I need to go and balance this, but in doing so, I thought that I was then therefore being biased. And yeah, I mean, the reality is, I think as more and more studies have come out, and I'm sure you agree with this, and you've seen this, but we have millennia of anecdotal evidence throughout all of human history. We also have a wealth of evidence in the 50s and 60s, anecdotal as well as as a lot of scientific, and then we have all the modern science. And again, every now and then I'll have a conversation with someone new, and they will say the same thing about, no, there's lots of like there's danger and harm. And I asked the question, I was like, well, please, someone show it to me. Someone show me conclusive harm that is worthy of the highest regime of control. I'm very happy to engage with them, but someone, if I can't find it, someone find it for me, please. Yeah, that's one of the biggest issues I think
Yeah.
we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, we come across the same thing oftentimes where it's like people are like, well, you have to balance all this positive with something negative. And it's like, okay, well, either A, we're dealing with a fully biased paper that has a particular agenda, and so that's also, you can't just bring that in unless you're also sort of referencing the biases in the agenda and all that kind of thing, which then puts us again back out of the, we're presenting negative information. So, well, you have to show us how much risk there is. Well, the risk is low, well, there's 2,000 people that called in. There's a CNN article a couple years ago, or maybe last year or something like that. 2,000 people called into a poison control center, because of psychedelics over the last year, and that's a 1,000% increase from the previous years. And oh my gosh, the world is ending, right? And then they sort of buried the lead, which is like, oh, also 11 million people had an experience last year. So, I mean, of course, there's a small amount of risk, but the risk is relatively small. And also, if you're talking about cognitive liberty, risk is relative. If somebody is dealing with
Yeah.
substance use issues and they want to get off of something, then the risk is relative. If someone's dealing with depression and suicidal ideation, the risk is relative. If somebody's dealing with other stuff that these can help them with, then let them make the choice, which again brings us back to cognitive liberty.
And sorry, just yeah, before we get there, and on top of that, because these substances are criminalized, that increases the chance of risk because there isn't adequate information. I mean, again, in a world where people understood these substances, understood how they could be best used, you strongly mitigate the risks. I mean, obviously, the main risk seems in all psychedelics seem to be the bad trip.
Mhm.
Um, Bad trips are, they have a very, like, I guess, a big dark shadow from a lot of people who don't understand the substances, who maybe had their first psilocybin experience, at a public music event or something like that, where, it's not, again, we look at these substances are very powerful in many different ways. And with decriminalization, and I think the access to information and research, you can really then start to teach people about the importance of set and setting, and mitigate the risks.
Mhm.
But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, no, and then just kind of speak to that, and maybe just wrap one other thing up is even the Controlled Substances Act, and I imagine this is the same with the 71 convention because you mentioned it had to have medical value. It's almost set up like the protector arm of the pharmaceutical industry. Because in order to get it off of Schedule One, the main thing that everyone's focusing on is medical value. Well, how do you have to get medical value? You have to take this full plant botanical or full mushroom botanical. You have to extract out, GMP certified, all these trials, all this money, da da da. At the end of the day, the only way to get out of that is to have, a substance that's passed trials that's extracted in synthetic because full plant botanical trials are often very variable and there's too much variability to actually go through these studies. So, in a way, plants and mushrooms will never be technically, available in this way unless you're talking about the actual molecules because it's always going to be extracted out. So you don't really know a mushroom with psilocybin, psilocin, beta carbolines, norbaeocysteine,
Yeah.
baeocysteine, et cetera, might never, a lot of those aren't sort of criminalized. But even in the policy here, you have some states that are like, oh, we're gonna, effectively, allow for polymorph psilocybin to happen, but they don't say anything about psilocin. right? So okay, well now mushrooms technically wouldn't be decriminalized or legalized or even medicalized because it has both of them in there. So I think even that the way the Controlled Substances Act is set up in terms of the medical route, forcing it through the medical route is really just kind of protecting the pharmaceutical industry from things that could be actually really helpful for folks. So I think that's another challenge that comes into play when you start talking about this, which is why if we can kind of remove ourselves from that, talk about cognitive liberty instead of medical value, then it kind of changes the whole game a little bit. Yeah, are you
Yeah,
finding?
definitely.
Good.
Sorry.
Good. I think we're on a little bit.
No, I was just yeah, and listen, just for for curiosity's sake, the pharmaceutical influence was present in the creation of the 1971 convention. Um, there were certainly some substances which did meet the thresholds, but were excluded because there were pharmaceutical interests from the governments to, allow these substances and their pharmaceutical companies to keep producing them. But yes, sorry, you were asking a question on the constitutionality.
No, I was just curious about your thoughts around that, and just kind of, I've always been fascinated about this process of how this Controlled Substances Act is really just leading people towards the medical pharmaceutical route, and this is another way. And I know you make an argument in your papers around cognitive liberty regarding privacy, and I know there's kind of bodily autonomy and privacy. I know there's also the idea of freedom of speech and thought, like you can't really have freedom of thought unless you have freedom of speech. Obviously, you can't have freedom of speech unless you have freedom of thought, which is kind of at the basis of cognitive liberty. You make the argument on bodily autonomy and privacy, and then of course there's the idea that freedom of thought is a necessary condition for all of the rights. Otherwise, we're not really, really don't have any rights because we're telling people what to think. So maybe unpack a little bit about your bodily autonomy and privacy issue, and then maybe sort of weave in some of those other ideas if you can.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as you mentioned, the two papers that I published a few years ago, one being on privacy and one arguing for cognitive liberty, or in South Africa, it's the freedom of security of the person, freedom of security of the person, which entails bodily integrity, which I then go further and say includes psychological integrity, which then includes cognitive liberty. Just keeping it simple, the privacy argument was taking the argument that partially decriminalized cannabis and it was extending it to psilocybin. And again, effectively, South Africa has very strong protection of one's privacy and one's effectively inner sanctum of privacy. We kind of look at a good example of privacy is, it's almost like this radiating circle. And at its core, that's where you have the most protection. And the state has the least right to intervene. And obviously, the further out you go, the state has more interest. And we have a case on I argue it in my paper, where a drug dealer was unlawfully arrested without a warrant. She was very clearly a drug dealer, but the court was like, "This is illegal because if we allow this, then we are invading her privacy, and if we invade privacy, there's a far more worse repercussions that follow from that." So yeah, very interesting arguments, I believe, to put out there. However, important to note in respect of psilocybin in this case, but again, it could be argued for other psychedelics. It is a partial decriminalization, and South Africa currently is working through the quagmire it's found itself in now, where we've got a judgment that has allowed for adults to use cannabis in a private setting. What does that entail, and how do you work it out? And we're currently still trying to, I guess, walk through the mud of the swamp. I hope with psychedelics and psilocybin we avoid that completely, and we just create a much clearer law. And then yeah, with cognitive liberty, as I mentioned, South Africa, we have a very progressive constitution, and one of our Bill of Rights, in our Bill of Rights, one of our rights is the freedom of security of the person. And then in looking at this, I took bodily integrity. Obviously, your right to your body to do as what you want. There's, and then I further this and said, well, the mind is part of your body. I mean, and if it isn't, the section does allow for further, ways to view this. It's not just contained in that. And so I came across the argument of cognitive liberty, which isn't just a protection of your conscious, right? It's not, excuse me, it's not just you have the right to not have your psychology affected with or messed with, things like that, but it should also be a right to do something, right? It's a right to explore your consciousness. And yeah, I think that it's a very important. It's important that we recognize that. I mean, it's weird. You have the right to do things to your body. You can get a tattoo, but you also prevent it from being marked. Like no one can come and brand you. That's very illegal. But you are allowed to effectively tattoo yourself or brand yourself. So the question then goes, well, why would one not be allowed to? If we're protecting our minds, why are we not allowing ourselves to explore it? And obviously, then I tie that into psychedelics. I think, one can argue that there's many ways in which you can explore your conscious without psychedelics. But that doesn't then, I don't think that sounds as a sound argument. Well, just because now psychedelics exist, you should now be, banned from using them if it is in the use of it, exploring your own consciousness. And as you said, we as adults should have the right to do that. And of course, there may be some risks, but those are risks that we agree to, or we accept, and the law for large part allows you to take risks. You can skydive, you can scuba dive, you can do these sort of things that could be dangerous. You can drink alcohol, you can smoke tobacco. Again, an element I touched. Sorry, you broke it there?
Extreme sports. There's another one that people do, skydiving, all that kind of thing, right?
No, of course. Yeah, and so one of the kind of elements that are in both these papers, I think the silver line between all of them, or the element that kind of runs through, is when does the state have to be a big brother, and when does it not? I argue this concept of state paternalism. When is it our father, our parent, and then when must it now not be? And I certainly think in the case of psychedelics and arguably to a degree other substances, the state is probably being way too paternalistic. It's reducing adults to an infant. It's saying you are not responsible enough to, or you do not know how to do this properly. Therefore, we're taking it away from you. No, especially when you look at in light of cognitive liberty, the problem with that is that, as you mentioned, it's like as soon as you take away someone's ability to think and act freely on their consciousness, well, then you start falling into issues that are bring into play dignity and personal freedoms, and then onto that democracy as well. The democratic process requires all adults to be able to think for themselves and to think actively and be active participants in society. Now, if you have a state that prohibits that, then that's we're not doing what we said we're going to do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure kind of the history of cognitive liberty here in the U.S. with Rye and Richard Glenn Moore. Rye was a UC Davis neuroethicist, and I know that they talked about the Bright Rule, which is kind of what you're speaking to as well, which is like you shouldn't necessarily you can say yes to psychedelics, but also you can say no to psychedelics. And that's the second part, right? And I think, and I kind of dug a little deeper into that, and I thought it was interesting, is that actually comes from, and you might know this as well, from actually, let me find it real quick here. Timothy Leary's Politics of Ecstasy from 1980. I don't know if you read that. And he has the
No, not yet.
two commandments for the molecular age. Okay, so it's Timothy Leary style, so I expect to go off a little bit, but interesting because these sort of golden rules or these bright rules of cognitive liberty kind of come from this, which is the two commandments he has is thou shalt not alter the consciousness of thy fellow man, and thou shalt not prevent thy fellow man from altering his own consciousness. So both the give and take there. So when you have sort of the Abby Hoffmans and some of the other people that say, oh, we're gonna douse the water supply with LSD or whatever, well, maybe I might chuckle at that idea. Technically that's against the ideas of cognitive liberty. So when you take this further down the road, it's really about it. Cognitive liberty here, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it's different for you all, but because there's such a hard tech oriented vibe hitting right now too, the cognitive liberty has also gone into that conversation around neuromarketing, around sort of other types of things that are enhancements or things that maybe the government should be more paternalistic about in terms of stopping these corporations from selling you the best product depending upon where your eye moves on the marketing piece, or how to work with propaganda, or all these other types of things, which are also kind of at the core of cognitive liberty. How are you seeing that kind of shake out in psychedelics law? Are you seeing that are you seeing people being aware of that and interested in that in terms of the technology safety as well? Or what's your thoughts in terms of cognitive liberty on both sides?
Yeah, let me come back to that, because you got me thinking something else here. And I want to make this very clear that like a lot of the drive of what I'm doing is first and foremost to decriminalize psychedelics locally, but I think globally that should be the starting point. I think, as you said, no one's forced to take this, but no one should be going to jail because they're taking it.
Mhm.
Okay, we can then have the conversation of what comes next. We can have the regulation conversation. We can say, okay, well, how do we best do this so that it doesn't become an issue, or we deal with the fears. All this sort of stuff. That conversation can come later, but first and foremost, no one should be being thrown in jail for it. No one should be prosecuted because they want to do this. And I think that should be the to me, I think that's the main next step for the entire community who's involved in decriminalization as well. Let's stop putting people in jail. And I know there's obviously, I think there's states in America which are doing this. Sorry, I see that. But obviously the rest of the world there isn't. And then, yeah, in terms of tech, I mean, look, then yeah, this 100% applies to cognitive liberty. And you say, well, we need then the state to step in. Then I agree, because when technology is being used in a way that we ourselves cannot control or protect ourselves, that's when government steps in. I mean, that's effectively, as I understand, that's when government is supposed to step in. It's when your rights do start to get infringed. Well, then governments act as the mediator and the regulator and control that. My personal fear, laws move slowly, and the damage is usually done in the interim. I only hope that we can see this coming and we can do something about it, because as you mentioned, I think it's already been done with marketing and with the psychology of it all. I've got a number of colleagues who are in this space and are much more focused on cognitive liberty and technology, and I'll maybe put you onto them and as a conversation for them to champion rather than me. But yeah, it's certainly, I think it will be a problem, and it is a problem.
Yeah, no, the only reason I bring that up is because oftentimes, at least in our bubble, we talk only about sort of the psychedelics and the ability to say yes to them, but also realizing like, wow, there's all this infringement. And even the Controlled Substances Act, in a way, is this propaganda piece that helps the government. All the other propaganda, all the other, algorithms, all the other stuff out there, in a way, the state maybe doesn't say, yeah, we need to stop this, because usually it's to help the state become more powerful and, get more control and, reduce privacy and all that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and just on that, I mean, that's also, I think, another, psychedelics aside, that's another push to recognize cognitive liberty as a right.
Right.
It's, again, I mean, I think as far as I'm aware, and I can stand to be proven wrong, but my paper on cognitive liberty was the first time it was mentioned in South African jurisprudence, right? So then there's a bit of an issue if it's only now being, considered. I really think it should be recognized, and I don't think it should just be recognized. Yeah, I think it makes sense. We protect our bodies. The government protects our bodies. We do have that protection. Well, then extend it to your mind. Anyways, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. And then that takes it from freedom of thought, which is just more like I can think what I want, to freedom of mind, which is really a protection of who you are as an individual. And so I think there's a lot of complexities here. I looked at some of the reasoning behind why freedom of thought isn't more explicit in some of these policy, and it's almost like, well, they try and like, kind of move around it. Well, it's not really, we're really going to talk about these things, but it's like, yeah, it's at the core of everything. If we don't talk about it, then we're lost in a way. Everything else is about how we can think freely and be able to make choices. Otherwise, you can choose anything you want unless it's choice A, or unless
Yeah.
it's not choice A, right? So I think that the bigger conversation around cognitive liberty is happening for sure, but I think it's unfortunately that the tech maybe is going to get it more into some of the sort of legislation, or in terms of the policy conversations, that it is with the psychedelics, because I think people are still afraid to say, oh, because it used to be, oh, you should be free to get high, and then that was like, well, we can't say that because there are too many people who are on the sort of the antagonistic side, the prohibitionist side, of saying, no, we can't do that, we can't let people explore their mind, explore their consciousness, or the word high is too risky because it's recreational, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
so we're getting close to the end here, but I do want to ask this question that we usually ask everybody as that comes on the show here. When you hear the words decriminalize nature, obviously you're doing a lot of work with this as well. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? What does that mean for the general public, etc.?
Good question. I hope there's not a wrong answer.
No, there's no.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I mentioned a lot of my work is I like to believe based in history, and I certainly want to just echo that. In doing a lot of research in the history of these substances, you realize we always have societal amnesia when it comes to psychoactives and psychedelics. These substances have been used throughout all of our history. Every civilization effectively on Earth has some relationship with them. In religious and spiritual texts, some even have reference to them around the world. So it's almost when you take that step back and you look at it from that perspective, it's almost a little bit weird to consider that we've now over 80 years prohibited these substances, or 50, 60, 70 years, to the point that society as a whole believes it to be the case that this is wrong, and that for all of human history, everybody came before us, they're wrong. Now, I've learned in my life so far that usually if things are done in the past to a degree, people, if it's done for many, many, many years, there might be an element of truth to it that you should keep it going, and it takes a lot of good argument to justify changing the past like that. Like it needs to be a fundamental societal shift. And when I look at psychoactives and the way we've criminalized them now, I don't necessarily see that justification lining up. I don't see that. So when you ask me what does decrimination mean to me, I certainly think that there's an element of returning to the state in which the world has usually been, and humanity has usually been. Of course, I don't want to throw us back and not necessarily learn from the past 50, 60, 70 years. I do think, though, we're in a very nice state now where we can perhaps take some lessons from the past, I guess, years of prohibition, as well as the context of the years of human growth that we've had alongside these substances, and then create a much more balanced, enjoyable, beneficial relationship with the substances going forward. I hope that's, to me, I think that decriminalization of nature would be very nice way to round it off. Whether that's possible, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. I'm sure every single jurisdiction will have their own ways of managing it. But yeah, certainly for me, I think it would line something like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean I always think about that, how somehow the last 50, 60 years becomes the only time frame in the history of the planet, right? Like, when you talk to people like, "Oh, well, it's always been like this." No, it's only been like this since 1970 or 1971, and we have so many years of history and culture and healing and stories and cosmologies and things like that that emerge from places all across the planet, and those have been eradicated through other means that weren't legal, oftentimes through missionary oppression and things like that, from European approaches through South America and Central America, et cetera. But yeah, you only have this short window, and then everyone's like, oh, we got to overregulate it. We got to figure out how to do these things. Da, 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 da. Like, no, we don't. We just gotta say, hey, let's just rewind 50 years, and like you say, also reflect on what's happened before and after, reflect on the things, the challenges and the risks that might come into play, how to best support them, how to do those sort of safety, risk reduction sort of strategies there to help people out, if they do have a difficult experience or whatever. But yeah, just to realize that 50, 60 years is just like a coffin time, it's basically nothing, right? In the whole
Not
sense.
even. It's
Yeah,
less of a blink.
yeah,
I know
exactly.
this happens to be the blink in which a number of us were born
Yeah,
and have
exactly.
lived. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Sebastian. I'm gonna throw it over to Rachel now. I know Rachel had a question or comment.
Oh, yes. Uh, Nice comments about the conversation. Also, thank you for having legal be interesting. I usually glaze over when it comes to the legal kind of topics, but it is very important, right? Like that saying where you may not be interested in politics or law, but it's very interested in you. So it's well worth to be well versed in it and to talk about these things. So my question is, I'm in Canada, so I think Canada and South Africa are and Australia, we all are under like the Commonwealth in terms of like certain laws and things like that. So I think there's some unique stuff as it comes between our situation and what the states gets to deal with as well as at a state level. But my question's more along the lines of here in Canada, we recently had to pass a bill because I used to be a personal trainer and work in fitness a lot. And so supplements, they had passed through something that effectively would make it so that you would need a prescription in order to get something like protein powder or creatine or things like that. So that kind of goes into the whole like medicalization of like psychedelics and stuff, right? Like, okay, make it available to you, but you will need like a prescription because it's now a medicine, right? So we had to recently pass a bill to basically reverse that. But a lot of the conversations in the house were like, well, how did this even get passed in the first place if it's something that like no one, the people didn't really want? So how did you end up doing this when we had to pass a bill to like reverse something that probably shouldn't have been done in the first place. So my question to you is like from an international level when it comes to law, is there a pathway or can you see a way of like how do we deal with laws that perhaps were passed and maybe they're wrong or they were only dealing with certain information at the time, and now that we have more information, is there a pathway to not like let's say reverse it, or like I guess you have to pass maybe something that undoes what was maybe unlawful in the first place. So thoughts on
Yeah, so good
that?
question. One that would probably require a lot of intimate knowledge of each jurisdiction's the way in
Mm,
which each jurisdiction works. I can speak from South Africa's perspective. Um, if there is an issue with the law, your options. Well, I imagine this is actually the case in most places. You either politically campaign for it to be changed, or you can challenge it in the courts, depending on
mm,
like for example, with the way in which we're doing with psilocybin at the moment, we're making an argument that there are constitutional rights that are infringed, and these rights they're unjustifiably infringed. Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
in South Africa we have a big element of the state has to justify if they're going to prevent you from you're having your rights. Again, I'm being very tentative to speak about other jurisdictions personally because domestically, I'm not a lawyer for those jurisdictions. I'm not very clued up on it. I can only uh, say what I know, but again, it's not professional in any way.
Not legal
I,
advice.
obviously,
No worries.
yeah,
Not
not
legal
legal advice,
advice.
but I would imagine, I mean, from what I understand, Canada to be, it also has quite a progressive view on rights. Now, I mean, in your example, the particular, I guess policy and politics is the only way to go about reversing those bills. But when it comes to psychedelics, I often ask myself, and I should actually ask other people, in these jurisdictions, I'm like, well, why is there not a movement from a collective or a group, to actually challenge these laws through the courts?
Mm,
I know in South Africa, that's something we're currently doing, and it's again we do with cannabis, and it's almost like this. It's a bit novel when I go overseas, and I'm like, have conversations with people, and they go, well, it's interesting, why are you challenging drugs through the courts? But again, it's how we're doing it here, and I would have to know more information on each jurisdiction as to know why they're not doing it there. I certainly think the arguments we're making here are transferable to other jurisdictions, especially because they're grounded in human rights. So if a domestic jurisdiction has regard for those human rights, of which, for example, let's just take the best one I have here, which is privacy. I mean, I'm pretty sure many of our shared jurisdictions, privacy is a
mhm.
well-recognized right and it's well protected. Well, why are the arguments not being made before a court?
Yeah.
Now, again, I don't know the exact details of what courts can and cannot hear in each jurisdictions, but I'd like to potentially see that happening elsewhere.
I like that. I like that response because maybe I can do that here. Can
Yeah,
replicate things in
perhaps.
other places as well. Because I think it's just as you're like, I love how you brought up novel a lot because I think that's the best way to kind of deal with the challenge that we have at hand. Like bring in novel ideas that, or maybe not net new, but we just remember something really like ancient that humanity is supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So great answer. Back to you, Larry.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and I think even there's something that because I looked into this a little bit, or maybe you mentioned this in your paper that maybe in the U.S. privacy isn't as protected as other places because obviously it's a good excuse for everyone to be like, oh, we got to make sure everyone's doing the right thing, So, but to your point, how is this being addressed in the courts? It's being addressed through freedom of religion. And so that's the way here, at least in the US, that people are sort of addressing this topic in the court system. And you have the Native American Church, the Union de Vegetal, the Santo Daime, Church of the Condor and the Eagle, and a couple new ones with DEAs actually exempting them now on their own. But that was the process because they had to go through a DEA exemption, and DEA was, dragging their feet on it because they're not the drug enforcement allowance, they're a drug allowance organization, they're the drug enforcement organization, right? So there's been a little bit of change in that, so they don't have to go to courts. But I think that's because they've been losing so many times in courts that at some point in time, people are going to be like, well, wait a second, why do you guys keep losing? Like maybe this isn't an issue that should be criminalized in the first place, right? So yeah, I know that's how that's happening here, but it'd be great to see a cognitive liberty conversation start happening on the courts because it allows for a lot more than a specific dogma that oftentimes each church has to show that they have this particular dogma and ministers and book and all that kind of thing in order to be given an allowance as a church or as a religious institution.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to get to the point where we're not having conversations in court about these many exemptions. I would love to. I mean, maybe this is me being youthful and naive. I would like to get to a point where we go to the courts and we go, this is the whole issue. Let's come. Let's get to a decision on this. If we can't do it politically, let's challenge it holistically, not just small exemptions here and there. But again, Larry, maybe this is a conversation when we see each other again. I can spend some more time looking at what's happening in the States, and see maybe there are arguments that are transferable and could help there as well as Rachel in Canada. I think sometimes all we need to do is put people from different jurisdictions in the room together and see what hits.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the brainstorming potentials are available there. So yeah, is there
Yeah,
anything else,
certainly.
Sebastian, that we haven't mentioned or talked about that you want to sort of bring into the conversation today?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot. Let me just take the time. No, I think we've had a good conversation. Unless there's any other questions from your guys' side, and
So how would people out there that want to kind of talk to you about cognitive liberty or policy, or maybe they live in South Africa or Germany or Switzerland and want to connect with you, or coming up to the local or the upcoming psychedelic culture conference? What's a way to contact you? Some information. Where can we find your information online? Maybe read some of your papers.
yeah, sure. LinkedIn, DM me on LinkedIn is probably the best way. Otherwise, my email address is on there. My LinkedIn is Sebastian William Foster, and also Instagram is also Sebastian William Foster. So nice and simple. Certainly, pop me an email or a DM on LinkedIn. I'll be in South Africa for another week, enjoying the rest of the sunshine here, and then I'm off to California for this conference, which I'm very, very excited for. It'll be my first in-person international conference, and this has been a good conversation to kind of get those thoughts going for that. And then after America, I'll be back in Germany for the next semester of my LLM, and then we'll see from there. Obviously, when I'm done with that, and hopefully by the end of July, I will head off to Switzerland and continue my PhD. But by then, you'll have some more information on what. Hopefully, we'll have a strong argument from the international law. Yeah, we'll see what we can do with that.
That sounds great. And then you said you're 10 a.m. on Friday for the conference in San Francisco coming up.
Yes, I think I must get the dates correct. I think it's about 10 a.m. on the 17th, Friday the 17th, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I'm on track one, so main stage.
Great, awesome. Well, I'm sure there'll be quite an audience here. It's a good conversation to be having, especially in the Bay Area. So I think people really appreciate it, and it's a great conference to go to. So thank you for coming out here. Thank you for being here on the show today and talking to us a little bit about cognitive liberty. I'm sure we could have another 4 or 5 conversations at least, just to unpack things in a little bit of a different way, or kind of explore all the different sort of tendrils of this bigger conversation around politics and law and international policy and that type of thing. So thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate all your insights. As a reminder, everyone, we are going live every 2 weeks, but this month, because it's holiday month for psychedelic folks, our next show is going to be on April 26th. So keep that in mind. Mark that on your calendar. That's going to be at, let's see here, looks like 3:30 p.m. Pacific time with Laura Shapiro. Laura Shapiro is running an all-women ibogaine clinic called Basse, and also partnered with Kat Courtney, who was on our show about 4 or 5 months ago. So check that out. Keep in mind, you can always find our shows either live on YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey, or in a couple weeks from now, you'll find them on Spotify, Apple, or other podcast platforms. And we'll start putting out some clips from this show probably in the next month or two as we start getting everything all organized there. So we'll send those out to Sebastian and everyone else out there. So again, thank you very much for being here. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe to our channel to keep updated. And thank you again to Sebastian and Rachel for the conversation. Always a pleasure. Happy Easter, everybody. Until next time, tune in, stay rooted, and let's grow together. Have a great Sunday.